What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, aka Mr. Delks Moses. I anoint myself with grease and I'm governed by caprice. And today is episode 14 of our 10th book in our Booked React series, Racism in Europe, written by MacMaster. This book came out in the year 2001, and it covers the years 1870 to the year 2000. And this is a very powerful book that we've been reading over the past few weeks, and we're only down to like the last two chapters of this book. So for today's episode, we're going to be reading chapter 6. You can find this book on Amazon for the humble price of only $22.52 paperback, $66 hardcover. Great book that you should include in your library or pick it up yourself online for free if you're not about supporting that capitalist system where Jeff Bezos is sending billionaire friends up into outer space, right? So for anybody that's interested in this live stream, jump into the live stream chat. Would love to hear what you have to say about this book. And always remember, before we start reading any book in the Booked React series, we will always jump into the comment section first. So if you can't join the live stream, leave a comment under the previous videos and we will always read them at the beginning. So going now to the comment section here, we just have only two that I want to get to. So this one comes from XXXZAMO XXX, and he titled, "It's inevitable now, prepare yourself." And I replied, "What is inevitable?" This I sort of take as a threat. I don't know exactly what he means by this, but I assume that this is a threat because I've been getting these weird emails of people trying to get into my bank accounts, people trying to hack into my Gmails, people have trying to target me, right? And I assume mostly that they're white supremacists or scammers in general who don't like my messaging on YouTube. So I assume that this is a threat for something inevitable that will happen to me. So bring it on. Bring it on. I am not scared of any of you small internet people, any of you small dick white supremacists on your computers anywhere across the world. Try to hack into my accounts. You'll find that there are $0 there and negative cents. That's what you'll probably find. All right. Second comment that I find here that we're going to read comes from Big Barry. Big Barry, 8343. And Big Barry says, "Strange question. Most European communities have never seen any black person until a few decades ago." And I replied, "Literally not true. The book itself and the white man who wrote it prove you wrong. Read a book." And this is an ignorant comment from people who, don't have an open mind, have never tried to educate themselves on the history of black folks in Europe. And this just comes from plain ignorance. In this book alone that we've read, black people have been in Europe for centuries, small communities, also larger communities. Like in Portugal, there were close to like 500,000 black people living there in the 17th century. So yeah, it's not uncommon for people to think this way, but that's the reason why we read these books, is to provide information for people so they don't have these misconceptions. Don't let anybody ever tell you that black folks just recently showed up in Europe, as if for the past few decades we've just been washing ashore. There was slavery in Europe of black people in France, in the UK, in Portugal, in Spain as well, Cyprus, Turkey, the Balkans as well, that black people were in chains across Europe. Black people were here even before we were in chains because we were the original people on the planet who colonized the entire planet. Before then, after then, because we jumped from two very extreme periods, right? Even then, before like the transatlantic slave trade, black people were coming to Europe doing trade and business and that sort of stuff. The Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire were very large and expansive empires that went into Africa, and black people were a part of that as well. And yeah, we also have to remember Carthage, Hannibal, etc. The African influence on Europe is very important. In fact, there wouldn't be a Europe that we know of today were it not for Africa. So yeah, this is just a purely ignorant person. Big Barry, go and read a big old book. All right. So without further ado, all right. Door of L says, brilliant people have been in Europe for thousands of years. Cheddar Man, says Door of L. Shout out to Door of L. Yeah, Cheddar Man and all the other bones, fossils that they find of people thousands of years ago that inhabited Europe, did the DNA test and saw that they were melanated people, dark-skinned people, probably even darker than me, right? So shout out Door of L. And yeah, so we're going to be jumping into chapter 6. Like I said, we read this part. We're going to be readings Dorvel says, greetings, I will try to stay on topic. Well, shout out Dorvel, man, but let anything you say just be just let it be smart. You know what I'm saying? We just want people that are here to actually, like, do some thinking with their brain. This is a place where you can pause all the, the booty shaking that you watch on YouTube, all the music you listen to on YouTube, all the BS that you can find on YouTube. And this is where you can actually come and learn something, right? This is trying to be like an oasis of education in a desert of people that usually, have their brains turned off when they turn on YouTube. But yeah, Dorvel, say anything you want. But anyway, we're going to be talking about racism in the age of labor immigration, 1945 to 1974. Basically, when we read this introduction right here in the previous live stream, the author is writing about how after World War II, much of Europe was destroyed. Many men from across the European colonies came to fight in Europe, and some of them decided to stay behind and build their lives there. And also many people were invited to come back or invited to come to Europe for the first time to help the rebuilding process. So these were black men, Asian men, Middle Eastern men, etc., right, who were coming to Europe. Also, at the end of World War II, basically, racism, like the formal types of scientific racism, were falling out of favor because once they beat the Nazis, the new regimes that came into power said, we cannot base our societies on the idea that the white man is inherently superior, right? Because that's the whole reason why they fought the Nazis. They said the Nazis were racist, that they were xenophobic, that they were anti-Semitic, all these sorts of things, right? So now they have to build a new regime, and now we start to see the fall of formal race science, even if racism still persisted through the use of culture as another way of talking about racism. Instead of saying black people are inherently inferior or Middle Eastern people are inherently inferior, they have a culture that is not in aligned with our superior European civilization, as the white supremacist said. So let's go here. We're going to be reading this part. The attack on the science of race. The attack on scientific racism had already begun to gather strength during the interwar period, particularly among British and American scientists who set out to discredit Nazi racism. That race was no longer universally accepted as a self-evident fact, like the force of gravity, was indicated by the first use in English during the 1930s of the neologism racism. The idea that belief in the reality of fixed races was itself a misguided doctrine or myth. The single most famous expression of this anti-racist revisionism was a small book by Julian S. Huxley, A.C. Hayden, and A.M. Carr Saunders, We Europeans, published in 1935, which explained modern genetic theory in layman terms to show that biological races did not exist. Mendelian theory, it argued, demonstrated that human populations were so intermixed by millennia of migration and shared such a vast pool of genetic material that it was not possible to divide them into pure races. Racism, including contemporary Nazi theories of Aryan or Nordic supremacy, was based on an original ideal type, a myth of a pure race that had never existed and which could never be recovered in the present through some kind of eugenic selection that would filter out the inferior elements that had become mixed into the blood. Contemporary violent racialism or Nazism was interpreted as a symptom of virulent nationalism, which was seeking to provide itself with scientific legitimacy and false explanations for problems that had deep economic, political, and social roots. The book recommended that the term race should be dropped from the vocabulary of science and be replaced by the term ethnic group. Generally, I agree with that. I generally agree with that. There's nothing there that I want to comment on even more. Yeah, race in and of itself as a social construct should be abolished, but the white folks still want to keep holding on to race. It's not black folks or other people that are marginalized or oppressed by racism that want to maintain race. It's the white folks that continue to divide people by saying, well, their culture is not conducive of ours. Or still, there are some people that believe in IQs or inherent intelligence deficiency for certain groups of people. All right? Doravel says, I want to give you 2 book suggestions and you will understand where I'm coming from. Before, Joseph R. Gibson, Trapped in Rainbows and How Racism Has Changed the Human Brain. I'm going to screenshot that right now, Doravel. We're going to capture that with the screenshot. Boop. Caught that. schoolwork, English teaching work, a lot of that. But definitely those will be on the agenda and we will try to read those. So thank you, Dorvel, for the book suggestion. Anybody else with a book suggestion, put it in the comments. But tell me what those books are about. I can see how racism has changed the human brain. That's self-evident in the title. But Trapped in Rainbows, let us know what Trapped in Rainbows is about. So, We Europeans, the book, was an important text since it clearly established the central components of the anti-racist paradigm that became dominant throughout the second half of the 20th century. However, in spite of the attempts by liberal scientists to counter Nazi racism through populist works before the outbreak of the Second World War, in reality they were able to change the attitudes of only a very tiny segment of the educated public. A more significant shift had to wait until the more receptive political climate of post-Holocaust Europe. The most important initiative was undertaken by UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which in December 1949 convened a committee of experts on race in Paris, symbolically in the same building that had been 5 years earlier the German military headquarters. The Committee of International Experts in Anthropology, Sociology, Genetics, and Social Psychology drew up a statement on race on July 18, 1950, which was widely disseminated in the media and used worldwide as the key text in educational programs. The statement presented in an abbreviated and clear form ideas very similar to those of we Europeans. All mankind belong to the same common stock, and biology supported the ethic of universal brotherhood. Since educability and plasticity had been at the premium in man's mental evolution, cultural experience rather than race had been crucial in the development of human groups. There was an essential similarity in mental characteristics among all human groups. The concept of race was so scientifically untenable and had been the cause of such barbarism that it would be better to drop the term altogether and to speak of ethnic groups. Once again, I see nothing that I disagree with here. That's fire. Absolutely fire. I mean, it's always, heartening to find out that even during the times when, racist ideology or scientific racism, eugenics was popping at its peak, thought it would never end, there were people that were fighting against that paradigm shift. They were fighting against that paradigm and pushed for a paradigm shift. So it lets you, once again, reading this book has given me hope. Reading about the history of the Jewish people as they were oppressed, reading about the scientists and the anthropologists, sociologists, biologists that were pushing against racist propaganda at the time when it was at its zenith, gives me hope that the era that we're living through right now of fascism on the rise, democratic backsliding, the return of virulent forms of race essentialism, it gives me hope that we can overcome these things because it has been done before. Continuing here. In the immediate post-war years, UNESCO exemplified the official anti-racist position, which showed an overly optimistic faith in the power of education and enlightened rationalism to dispel racism by showing that it has built on unscientific and mythical ideas. However, the crusade against racism, while it did much to create a climate of opinion in which most politicians avoided public statements of prejudice, did not eradicate the deep historic roots of European racism. Go into the comments here. Dora of L says, Trapped in Rainbows details how white supremacy and overall oppression stress appears to be factors in homosexuality. Interesting. That's an interesting premise here. I've always been I'm trying once again not to if I remember right, Doravel was the brother that came up last time and was talking about how modernity is tied to homosexuality. I remember that, if I remember right. Now it's all coming back to me. But once again, I'm still perplexed by the obsession with homosexuality that some people have. While white supremacy is the main target that we should have our eyes on, I cannot understand, even if homosexuality is an outgrowth of white supremacy, why we should focus on that more. Please explain why we should focus on homosexuality when there are other elements of white supremacy that are more vicious, more malignant, such as neocolonialism, such as police brutality, such as not having access to capital and good jobs, and lower educational attainment or access to education, environmental racism. Why should we focus on homosexuality out of all the other things that white supremacy brings forth in the world? Let me know. Doravel says Joseph R. Gibson is a phenomenal researcher and the sources are valid. Once again, I'd be interested to look into Joseph R. Gibson's work and we might read into it. But out of all the things to focus on that white supremacy has brought us, why focus on homosexuality? Somebody answer that question. Why focus on the gays, the lesbians, the trans people when white supremacy is doing much worse? Doravel says a feminization is a reason. A feminization of who? Because before homosexuality was widely accepted throughout the Western world, the black man was already effeminized. And a feminization of black people still continues. Even if we were all heterosexual and masculine, black men can never be the face of masculinity. Black men are often denied their masculinity because of the powers of white supremacy. And so how can we focus on homosexuality? And then also on top of that, not every homosexual man, and in this case black man, is effeminate. There are gay black men that are masculine, more masculine than most heterosexual men. So explain that. Anyway, a number of factors contributed to a powerful continuity between pre- and post-war racism, although this was often concealed under an official discourse that excoriated the evils of Nazism and vowed that such barbarism should never be allowed to recur. Firstly, it was not easy for the new anti-racist science to demonstrate and convince public opinion of the rather difficult genetic and anthropological theories that would rationally dissolve the racial categories. Science was counterintuitive and seemed to be denying the differences of black and white that were so real and objective to common sense racism. Instead of going into retreat, the unhyphenated term race continued to be used at all levels of society, including within legislative acts, thus reifying the very concept that some were seeking to dissolve. Secondly, anti-racist education could do very little, at least not in the short term, to change or uproot the racial stereotypes and opinions that had over many centuries become so powerfully woven into the very fabric of European culture. Pre-war generations, brought up, socialized, and educated in a world saturated with racism, could not readily discard old ways of seeing and thinking. For the younger post-war generation, popular culture continued to be steeped in negative racist images and messages, from school textbooks, boys' comics, and Hollywood films to advertising. It would take many decades for European sociologists and education theorists to begin to recognize the sheer complexity and rootedness, the subtle disguises and power of racism, embedded in language and constructions of individual and group identity. Thirdly, as was to become increasingly apparent towards the close of the century, as archives were opened and Europeans began to come in to terms with their complicity in genocide, the post-war exposure and purging of Nazis and fascist collaborators involved in the final solution, from Switzerland to Hungary, was in reality applied only to a tiny fraction. Post-war Germany and France quietly and discreetly reintegrated racists into the structures of the state, from ministers and civil servants to academics, doctors, judges, and police officers. There was a significant continuity between pre-war and post-war political elites who carried with them the baggage of colonial racism and anti-Semitism. Although these elites trimmed and often adopted new credentials as Democrats, liberal progressives, or socialists, there is extensive evidence from private diaries and letters of ongoing but concealed prejudice. Very interesting. I just want to go back up here to this part. It was not easy for the new anti-racist science to demonstrate and convince public opinion of the rather difficult genetic and anthropological theories that would rationally dissolve the racial categories. Science was counterintuitive and seemed to be denying the difference of black and whites that were so real and objective to common sense racism. Okay, so yeah, basically what he's trying to say here is that, the scientists were telling people, hey, race is a social construct, it's not real. And regular people were saying, how are you going to tell me that a black person with very big lips, a very big nose, and much darker skin than I, and very different hair than I, are not different types of people? right, are not essentially something different, right? And to some degree, the average layman, the average person is right. There are phenotypical differences, but it was hard for people in the mid 20th century, before, education was widely accepted. People that just left the World War period, people that didn't have a lot of education and were struggling and stuff like that, to understand that things go a lot deeper than just the skin, right? And also appearances. So that's one thing, right? So that I think that relates to like how in our day and age, a lot of people don't believe the experts. The experts say that, gender is a social construct, gender is not real. But then, like, for example, now a lot of people say, how are you going to tell me somebody born with a penis and somebody born with a vagina, their gender is not tied to their essential nature, right? And so that's what there's a disconnect, and it often takes the layman person or layman people many years to catch up to what science has already told them, that something is something needs to be adjusted in our perception of things, right? So, and basically what they're trying to say is like, even though the science was there and they were telling people that race is not real, it would take many, many years until people actually caught up with it. And after World War II, many of the former Nazis, the racists, the fascists, and many European countries were quietly like let back into power, and their racism was never like dealt with, right? Going now to the Dorval, he says, that is why it is a ego defense mechanism and the way a person cope with stress, trauma, oppression. The book details all that I'm saying, and when you take time to read them, you will be fascinated. Phenotype is not racial type. We have the most genetic diversity. That's true, Dorval. Yes, we do have the most genetic diversity as, African people descended of the people of Africa. So yeah, I agree with that part. But let's say hypothetically, Dorval, I'm going to take your premise as true. There are gay black men and gay black women who are homosexual because it is a defense mechanism they created to deal with the trauma of their life, right? Let's think about all the other trauma defenses that black people create to deal with the traumas of life, whether that trauma is rooted in their blackness, as in the existential danger of being black in a white supremacist world, or for other things that most people go through, whether that be childhood abuse, neglect, poverty, hunger, etc., right? Which one is, once again, more important? I'm trying to understand. Which is more important? Dealing with the homosexuality of some black people, or the poverty, the rates of crime, the abuse, the nihilism, the depression, the suicide? Which is more important to deal with? Focusing on a select group of black people who will always be a minority. There will never be a majority of gay people in any society, right? Which is more important to focus on, the supposed trauma defense that black people create when they decide they want to sleep with another man or another woman, or the several other things that we do as people that is detrimental to us? Help me understand. Because once again, I cannot for the life of me understand people's hyper obsession with the homosexual community or with homosexual acts. If you are obsessed to this degree with homosexuality, it makes me side-eye you. It makes me look at you sideways if you continue to obsess about this thing, out of all the other things that white supremacy creates. All right, continuing here. Post-war labor, immigration, and racism. However, despite such continuities, the overall social, economic, and political context within which this racism operated were profoundly transformed. During the period from 1945 to 1974, the age of mass labor immigration, European political racism switched its prime target from Jews to the black minorities. As we have seen during the period from circa 1870 to 1945, although black minorities were the object of racial stereotyping, in general throughout Europe, they never came to constitute a major concern of political racism. On the whole, blacks were viewed as an external other, and although boys' literature and film could portray the African savage with a frisson of horror as a cannibal and idol worshiper, blacks were located in an external and distant imaginary space that constituted no real threat to the European sense of internal security. I have to look up this word. I feel like I saw this word before. Frisson. Frisson definition. Let's look up this. Okay. All right. All right, here we go. A frisson. So basically, frisson, da da da. All right. Frisson. A strong, sudden feeling of excitement or fear or thrill. So basically, black people could cause some white people to have a strong excitement through their presence or through the thought of them. But generally, there was no political racism, meaning there was no official segregation. There was no, well, there were places, right? Like in the UK, they banned, what was it, France? I forgot which country, because I read this in this book. I forgot exactly which country it was. Oh, yeah, of course. It was Nazi Germany that banned interracial marriages and stuff like that. Yeah, so, yeah, there was no political racism outside of the extent of Nazi Germany, right? Anyway, continuing here. Anti-Semitism, however, was far more potent a force, extended itself across continental Europe, and drew its strength from deeply felt anxieties and phobias that perceived the Jews as a dangerous and even deadly power entrenched within the heart of society. With the arrival of many hundreds of thousands of immigrant workers from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, black people moved from the distant colonial sphere into the heart of metropolitan society, where they constituted a palpable presence and a perceived threat. Blacks thus became the main target of racism just at the moment when post-Holocaust anti-Semitism was in retreat or had gone underground. A number of factors worked towards this inversion of racisms, so that anti-black racism began to take precedence over anti-Semitism. Although the UNESCO statement opposed all forms of racism, in reality, the barbarism of Nazism became associated for most Europeans almost uniquely with the extermination of 6 million Jews. The extermination of other minorities, including gypsies, Slavs, and homosexuals, was also largely suppressed or neglected. This meant that a particular brand of racism, anti-Semitism, aroused the most powerful feelings of revulsion and horror, while the legitimacy of more benign forms of anti-black and colonial-based racism was relatively unaffected. Negative racist stereotypes of the black continued to have wide currency in the media, while the traditional anti-Semitic stereotype, the thick-lipped, hook-to-nose Jew grasping bags of gold, was seen as politically unacceptable. The small and fragmented political movements of the extreme right found that espousal of anti-Semitism left them marginalized, while campaigning against the newly arrived immigrants found a ready public response. Going to the comments, Dora of L says, I am just fascinated how the studies and how the brain works to explain how people internalize and choose different avenues of coping with stress. I am intrigued with how the brain works. I mean, that's interesting, but I want to ask you, Dorvel, do you think your heterosexuality is a way of dealing with stress? Presumed heterosexuality. I will presume, Dorvel, that you are a heterosexual, because most people are, right? But I'll have to ask you, is your heterosexuality, your attraction to big booty women or big titty women, a way of dealing with stress? Because you're assuming, to some degree, through this book that you've read and others, that people's homosexuality is somehow their way of dealing with stress or oppression. Anyway, continuing here. That found a ready public response. For example, Oswald Mosley's Union movement, the post-war successor to the British Union of Fascists, began from circa 1951 to convert its public campaigning and propaganda from anti-Semitism to attacks on immigrants as criminals, carriers of disease, and sexually promiscuous primitives, who would subvert the white race through miscegenation. The evolution was in later years followed by most far-right parties throughout Western Europe, from the French Front National to the German Republikaner and Austrian Freedom Party. As we shall see in Chapter 7, this does not mean that anti-Semitism disappeared. Indeed, for many fascist groups, it remained the core doctrine of the militants. But it was concealed or overlaid for purposes of political campaigning by anti-immigrant racism. So basically what they're trying to say here is After World War II, these new countries started, disavowing the Nazi ideology and stuff like that, and people were being taught about the, Holocaust and how it mostly affected the Jews, right? But they were still not trying to highlight the fact that Hitler also targeted mixed race black and German people, right? Or gypsies or homosexuals or communists and that sort of stuff, right? It mostly focused on the attacks on Jews, right? And so anti-Semitism became like the third rail in European politics and society, right? Meanwhile, we still had French colonialism happening. We still had British colonialism happening. We still had Spanish colonialism happening, Portuguese, etc., right? And that was somewhat tolerated. And also anti-blackness through media, through language was still tolerated, as well as anti-gypsy, anti-homosexual, that sort of stuff was tolerated as well in society, right? And so, yeah, these new parties said they're not going to focus so much on anti-Semitism because that's a no-go, right? But these far-right parties, instead of targeting the Jews, said we're going to target the blacks, the Pakistanis, the other immigrants that are moving to Europe, and they want to poison our blood by sleeping with white women, right? Continuing here. The rest of this chapter will center mainly on the phenomenon of immigration during the period 1945 to 1974, and how this generated strong forms of anti-black racism. This extremely rapid and large-scale movement was, during this phase, largely confined to the more advanced industrial economies of Northwest Europe, Britain, France, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Scandinavia. And it is with these states that we will be mainly concerned. The poorer nations of the South, with a large traditional peasant sector, like southern Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Yugoslavia, acted as reservoirs of migrant labor during this period, and only in the last quarter of the 20th century, after modernization and industrialization, did they, in turn, become countries of immigration receiving migrants from North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Gonna go to the comments right here. Dorivel says, I used sex myself in the past to cope with stress. Read the books. They detail it all with sources. Joseph R. Gibson is a former school principal and had written over 20 books. I will, Dorivel, right? So I have to ask you, not exactly using sex, because you can have sex with anything. You could have sex with a hole in the wall. You could have sex with an apple pie. You could have sex with a woman. You could have sex with a man. And unfortunately, you can have sex with animals and other things that I will not mention. But I'm talking about your heterosexual attraction. Because what you said earlier, Dorvel, is that some people might have homosexual attraction as a way of dealing with stress caused by the onset of white supremacy. I want to know, is your heterosexual attraction a part of your stress mechanism, stress defense mechanism for dealing with white supremacy? Please explain that. Because I'm trying to understand this fixation, once again, on homosexuality. I'm still not getting the answer why we should focus on homosexuality. You said you're interested in the brain. That's one thing. But let us know why I should be interested as well. I'm interested in the brain. I'm interested in how the minds of white folks work and how the minds of black folks work under white supremacy. But I'm very interested why you want to go into the minds of gay black people to such a degree. Make that make sense for me, right? Why is that more important than the drug use, than the drug selling, than the violence, than the suicide, the self-harm, the self-hate that we have as a people? Why is that? Why is homosexuality more important than all of those other things? Continuing here. All right, anti-immigrant racism in this southern zone only began to build up at a much later stage, during and after the 1990s, with, for example, violent anti-Moroccan riots in the Spanish town of El Ejido in February 2000. Behind the Iron Curtain, the communist states, Poland, Hungary, the USSR, Czechoslovakia, etc., remain largely free of the forms of international migration that most commentators interpreted as specific to neo-colonial and capitalist states. Although the Democratic Republic of Germany, or GDR, had by the late 1980s developed a curiously similar pattern of cheap contract labor from communist regimes in Vietnam, 60,000 migrants, Mozambique, 16,000 migrants, Cuba, Angola, and elsewhere. Anti-black racism needs to be understood within the general context of guest worker or labor immigration systems. The years 1945 and 1974 witnessed an almost unprecedented phase of sustained economic growth and of low unemployment, an economic miracle that, given the general shortage of labor in Northwest Europe, could only be sustained by recourse to mass immigration. By circa 1980, Western Europe contained a population of about 16 million foreign workers, of both European and non-European origin. The economic benefits of recruiting workers from North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, from Sub-Saharan Africa, Senegal, Mali, Nigeria, etc., the Caribbean, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Indochina, Turkey, and elsewhere were considerable. Many of those recruited were young men in the peak of physical strength and without dependence. They constituted a reserve army of mobile, flexible labor that could be put to work on the back-breaking and dangerous tasks that Europeans were refusing to take on. Work in the great heat of foundries and toxic chemical plants, in coal mines, road sweeping, road construction, or that involved unsocial hours and shift work. These migrants of mainly peasant origin had no experience of industrial labor and trade unionism, so that management could deploy them to break strikes, to undercut wages, and to weaken class solidarity. Because first wave migrants were mainly single, without children, wives, or elderly parents, they involved very low social costs for the host state: schools, healthcare, family housing. Ideally, at a time of labor shortage, such immigration could be encouraged. But in times of recession and increasing unemployment, migrants could be both the first to be made redundant and also be repatriated to the country of origin, thus avoiding the high costs of unemployment benefits. Sounds like Hungary. Sounds like Hungary and many other European nations that are using their economic growth, that are using black bodies as the fuel for their economic growth. Not just black bodies, but bodies from the developing world, the third world, the outer worlds, etc., however you want to frame it. This sounds very similar to what's happening today. So such a system of labor migration was remarkably close in structure to South African apartheid, under which natives were forced into homelands in which the cost of reproduction, of raising and educating children to the age at which they could form a reserve of adult labor, was borne by the impoverished Bantustans. South African gold mines, industry, and service sectors could then call on this labor at will, but the migrant force had no settlement or political rights within white South Africa across the border from their artificially created homeland. In reality, the advantages to be gained from such an ideal guest worker model of international migration began to break down or become eroded from an early stage, and most European states were seeking to close the doors on primary labor immigration by 1973 and 1974. Governmental failure to regulate immigration, to control recruitment in an efficient way that would match numbers and skills to the requirements of the economy, remove foreign labor when contracts expired, and prevent the buildup of minority communities, in the long run created conditions that contributed significantly to the rise of a current of anti-immigrant racism. Although Britain, France, and the Netherlands made some attempt to control labor recruitment through official state agencies, in reality, these colonial powers were faced with an immediate post-war situation in which colonial peoples had full rights as subjects to free and unimpeded movements to the metropolis. Thus, new Commonwealth citizens migrated freely to the United Kingdom until the Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962. And the same applied to migration to France from Algeria, French West Africa, and the Caribbean dependencies, and to the movement to the Netherlands by Surinamese, Moluccans, and Antillians. Going to the comments, Dorvel says, the book details those are all ego defense mechanism and all people choose different avenues to deal with these stress-related traumas. I am into neuroscience and sociology. Very interesting, Dorvel. Once again, I said I would read the book, and we will probably do that for either 11 or 12 in the Book to React series. But let me know, Dorvel, once again, homosexual attraction is a defense mechanism because white supremacy does what? A feminization? Before we were, before gay black men could be prancing around on TV or on social media, we were already effeminized on the plantation. We were effeminized during Jim Crow when we were told we couldn't marry who we want to marry, go where we want to go, take our children where we want to take. A heterosexual black man is as effeminized under white supremacy as a homosexual black man. Somebody make it make sense to me how being homosexual as a black person is somehow more effeminate than being a heterosexual black man if, our bodies are still dictated at the hands of white supremacy. If our sexuality is still dictated by the whims of white supremacy, if our how we love and who we love is still dictated by the terms of white supremacy, who really is not effeminized as a black man? Let me know. All right, continuing here. European governments, as long as the demand for labor ran high, followed a laissez-faire practice and turned a blind eye to the uncontrolled entry, which left millions of immigrants to their own devices, without any specialist support in the areas of housing, health, education, or general welfare. This hands-off free market attitude saved governments from expenditure in the short run, but led to the accumulation of huge long-term problems. The concentration of immigrants in slum ghettos, zones of mass exclusion, and endemic poverty created the conditions under which a poor white racism began to grow and in which extremist parties were able to mobilize and build support. So basically, by having these young black men, young African men, young Middle Eastern men, whatever, moved to Europe to do the jobs that the Europeans didn't want to do for basically slave wages, right? They didn't allow these people to have citizenship or made their conditions in the country very tenuous with visas that expired, etc., like that, living on the margins. They were able to reap the benefits in the short term, but created long-term problems because now you have people living outside the city and favelas, shantytowns, slums, whatever you want to call it. And also you have the poor whites really fucking mad because all their jobs are now going to the Negroes or to the Arabs or to the Chinese, whoever is coming over, right? And so now you're allowing, the worst parts of humanity to fester. And this is, once again, all designed by capitalism. We have to be real that, a lot of racism comes from capitalism. The desire to divide the working class to some degree. Now, I'll stick by this, that a lot of white supremacy cannot be explained just only through a capitalist critique. We can not only say, yeah, the capitalists want to exploit us, that's why, they put our penises in jars, right? Or told us that we couldn't live where we want to live or marry who we want to marry. A lot of that can not only be explained through capitalism. There's a deeper thing there, but a lot of it can, all right? All right, continuing here. By the end of the 20th century, all EU nations had come to accept a similar negative and frequently racialized view of non-European economic migrants or of asylum seekers who were widely viewed as bogus political refugees. The aim of this chapter is to examine the processes by which the question of immigration became equated with a race problem, to such an extent that the term immigrant, and at a later stage refugee on its own, came to carry immediate associations of danger, of an alien and primitive presence that threatened European civilization and white priority in the area of housing, employment, education, and welfare. Going to Dorvel, he says, movie documentary suggestions, soundtrack to a coup d'etat, how European governments conspired to kill Patrice Lumumba. That's a very good movie documentary recommendation. I heard of this film, soundtrack to a coup d'etat. I forgot who made it, but I feel like I was listening to a podcast with the director of that film, because I heard that name before of that film, but I haven't seen it, right? I would love to learn more about Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, all the other Pan-African leaders that fought for liberation and unfortunately were killed by the CIA or MI6. So that's a very good recommendation. Any other movie recommendations, put them in the comments. Acty and I will be starting some movie reviews soon, just when we have more time. We saw Magazine Dreams the other day. So Magazine Dreams will probably be our big return. Our big return to movie reviews will be through Magazine Dreams. So I'm going to keep my lips shut on how I feel about the film, unless you ask, of course. But continuing here. Where were we? Okay. All right. While extreme right wing political movements did play some part in this process, on the whole, they had only a limited electoral impact prior to the 1980s. Far more crucial to the racialization of European politics was the way in which mainstream parties and governments of the center, right, and left, respectable defenders of liberal democracy and of human rights, became responsible for the spread of racist attitudes and discriminatory legislation. While much contemporary anti-racist activism has targeted extremists, neo-Nazi movements as the prime enemy, marching skinheads with swastika regalia. This has often obfuscated the fact that both governments and major parties have had a more significant impact on society through the reproduction of a less visibly dramatic but far more generalized and legitimate racism. Interesting. I'm interested to see where this goes. But continuing here, going to Doravelle. He says the director was Johan Grimprez. Grimonprez. No, I don't. Maybe I heard of it somewhere else. Maybe it was people talking about the film. But yeah, Doravelle. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe I didn't listen to the director, but I heard somebody else talking about it. But I've heard of this film before. We will watch that. What is Magazine Dreams about? Magazine Dreams is Jonathan Majors' film that he made a few years ago before the incident happened where he got chased by a white woman in New York because she took his cell phone, right? And so it's a story about this disturbed young man who is obsessed with becoming a professional bodybuilder and all of his foolish shenanigans. It's about a 2-hour drama film, though you can find some comedy in it. And it's an interesting film, to say the least. So Doravelle says, hit the like button, please. Yeah, for anybody watching out there, hit that like button. Shit, I'll hit it for myself. I'll hit the like button for myself, man. And y'all do the same thing, too. Please. Support your boy, man. We out here trying to educate the peoples. Trying to educate the peoples. Well, let's continue here. Let me know. Let me know what y'all think, man. Anyway. So, in general, throughout Western Europe during the post-war period, the racialization of politics, the process through which minorities of non-European origin became a central issue in domestic politics, was closely tied to the issue of labor immigration. Doravelle says, okay, I'm familiar with it. Let us know if you've seen Magazine Dreams, Doravelle, what you think of it. What you think of Jonathan Majors. What you think of him saying that he was looking for his Coretta Scott King and he found it in Megan Good. Let me know what you think about that. So, most, if not all, states passed through a transition from a first phase during which primary labor immigration was encouraged by the state and was more or less tolerated by the general public, to a second stage in which governments moved to halt further immigration, a phase that was accompanied by a more negative discourse on migrants described as a burden on the welfare system, as parasites, criminals, unassimilable, etc., both at the official and at the popular level. The timing of this transition varied significantly from one state to another. For example, the appearance of race as a major political issue tied to a rejection of labor immigration occurred at a relatively early stage in Britain, from circa 1958 to 1964. In the case of France, although Algerian migrants had been the target of racist hostility since the First World War, a hatred that was further deepened by the Algerian War, 1954 to 1962, in general, immigration flows from outside Europe by travailleurs immigrés, or traveling immigrants, a common term that emphasized the positive economic contribution of such workers, were seen as beneficial until the late 1960s. Immigration, perceived as a negative phenomenon, only became an issue central to French politics, to party agendas and electioneering between circa 1972 and 1982. In the case of Italy, like Spain and Greece, a country of late African immigration, the transition to a politics of race came even later, from 1986 to 1990. The following sections look more closely at Britain and France to illustrate the racial transition and evolution in policy and practice that had become generalized throughout the EU states by the late 1980s. Basically, what he's trying to say here is that, even the liberals and the creators, the people that were the architects of our modern nation states, in Western Europe at least, they went through this period where after World War II, there was no big talk about race or racism and that sort of stuff. But when the immigrants came and they decided to stay and they started to intermingle with the people and build their lives there, later on, that's when we see the creation of a racial politics, when race starts to enter into the political discussion about how do we integrate these people, what do these people mean to our society, is this good for social cohesion, etc. That's how I'm understanding that paragraph right here. So, immigration and racial politics in Britain. In November 1946, the British Cabinet Manpower Working Party calculated a national labor shortage of 1,346,000 workers, a shortage that governments sought to resolve through the recruitment of white European workers, the Irish, Poles, and European voluntary workers. Go into the comments. Dorvell says, I didn't see the movie Magazine Dreams. I think Jonathan Majors is an industry of Sambo and the Snap Queen. Is in an industry of Sambo and the Snap Queen. Okay. Jonathan Majors is in the entertainment business, right? And to some degree, blackness under the microscope, right? On the stage is a bit Sambo-ish. We have to understand, like, Sambo is a character, right? And all of our favorite entertainers, whether they be rappers, singers, actors, are playing characters. And so no matter how much you look at them, right? Being black under the white gaze for entertainment purposes is a bit of Samboing to some degree. So Black Macho Revisited, Reflections of a Snap Queen, Marlon T. Riggs. I guess that's another book recommendation. I've never heard of this Snap Queen. When I think of Snap, I think of food assistance. You get your Snap card, your Snap benefits. So are you talking about a welfare queen, Reflections of a Snap Queen? I got to get schooled on that. School me on that. What is a Snap Queen? Okay, is that like the female equivalent of Sambo? You got to break that down. Anyway, continuing here, in Britain, they were short about 2 million workers, and they sought to recruit white people to come. So secret cabinet and government papers now released show that both labor and conservative governments of the 1950s had a distinct racial preference for white migrant labor over the Caribbeans and Asians who had full rights of reentry under the 1948 Nationality Act. A Royal Commission report in 1949 noted that large-scale immigration would only be welcomed without reserve if the immigrants were of good stock and were not prevented by their religion or race from intermarrying with the host population and becoming merged with it. Barely concealed beneath this discreet or coded language were the traditional colonial phobias about racial miscegenation. By 1950, a total of 5,000 West Indian immigrants had arrived in the UK since the end of the war, yet this tiny number was already giving rise to high and exaggerated levels of anxiety among ministers that tell us more about pre-existing racial attitudes among political elites than about any social reality. During the decade 1955 to 1965, both Labor and conservative governments, in spite of their public condemnations of racism, moved towards a de facto support of the racist Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962 and the 1965 White Paper on Immigration. Basically, in the UK, they were short 2 million people. So you have millions of people in Africa, millions of people in the Caribbean, millions of people in other parts of the world, in Asia as well, who were perfectly able, legally, to come to the UK. They had every right to be there because they were a part of the Commonwealth. So it was like being a part of the European Union. You can live in Romania and move to Spain. But the UK government said, we would rather have people outside of our union of the Commonwealth. We would rather have the Irish, the Poles, any other white Europeans, as long as they're not black or Asian or something like that. We would rather have that. So that's why they passed the Immigration Act, Commonwealth Immigration Act, saying, stop, no more black people, no more foreigners into the UK. Would rather take the Ukrainians and the Poles, the Belarusians, etc. White supremacy. That goes to show, once again, capitalist exploitation is not enough to examine white supremacy, because many instances of anti-black racism contradict the best course of action for capital. It would have been much easier for the business people of Europe who want to extract as much value from labor as possible by getting the cheapest labor and the easiest labor legally. Instead, they would rather go through the means of going through extra work to get white labor that would have been much harder to retain. Once again, a capitalist critique is not enough to explain white supremacy, because a lot of white supremacist actions contradict capitalism, even hurts capitalism. Anyway, an examination of the background to the 1962 Act, a crucial watershed in the growth of state racism, provides vital evidence of the underlying forces that led to a deepening of post-war institutional racism. Caribbean migrants, who were offered employment in the unwanted tasks avoided by British workers, inevitably constituted the lowest paid strata in the working class and became concentrated in the most deprived slum areas of the inner city. Black migrants competed for housing in precisely those blighted zones of decaying properties, unemployment, and multiple deprivation, where the poor whites felt left behind and were unable to move out to the new towns and council estates. Going to the comments, Dorvel says, in 1950s, Eisenhower started the religious right movement. Interesting. Expound on that. Build on that. Because I feel like the religious right really got popping after the end of segregation with the 1965 Civil Rights Act, and basically all of those Christian-only schools popped up all across the South, those private schools. And then the religious right made abortion their main issue, right? And yeah, that was in the 70s, and it culminated with Reagan becoming president, the silent majority and all that stuff. But expound on how Eisenhower created the religious right. Anyway, so the indigenous population, steeped in an imperialist culture that emphasized the superiority of the Englishman, his civilizing mission to the African savage in his mud hut, experienced the physical presence of black neighbors as an ultimate symbol of their own degradation and marginalization in British society. The white population interpreted the black presence as an invasion, a threat to British culture, a taking over of our jobs, our housing, our women. Racism was a way of blaming immigrants for problems that were very real, poor housing, unemployment, etc., and provided simplistic explanations for complex phenomena or diverted attention away from government failure to tackle issues of urban decay, underinvestment, and poverty. At the same time, racism was a psychological mechanism by which the most deprived and insecure could reconstitute a sense of worth, a sense of Britishness that referred to a mythical and homogeneous community, to the good old days before the black intruder arrived. Working class racism during the 1950s was rarely expressed in the form of a cohesive theory or ideology, but rather in the form of lapidary, common sense, racist phrases. Coloreds have filthy habits. They molest our women. Blacks come over here to take our jobs. They are lazy and sponge off the welfare. Let them go back to the jungle. They attack and rob old ladies. So, yeah, basically common stereotypes of the poor whites. Going here to lapidary. This is a new word. We're going to learn some new words today. Lapidary. This is a funny word. Lapidary. All right, lapidary. All right, it's an adjective meaning here, relating to the engraving, cutting, or polishing of stones and gems. Okay. Yeah. Language elegant and concise. Okay, we're in relation to language, not to polishing stones and gems. Hold up. Lapidary. Let's put this here. Of language. All right. Elegant and concise, therefore suitable for engraving on stone. A lapidary statement. So basically short and sweet racism. Lapidary racism. Easy to understand. Within the inner city areas of immigrant concentration, mainly in London and the Midlands, black people were increasingly subject to racial abuse, assault, exclusion from clubs and dance halls, and full-scale mob actions or race riots, as in Liverpool, 1948, Deptford, 1949, Camden Town, 1954, Nottingham and Notting Hill, 1958. In the latter riot, which continued from August 23rd to September 2nd, white crowds of several hundred people carrying banners with the slogan, "Deport all N-words," assaulted West Indians and besieged their homes and clubs. This is crazy. That's crazy. That's crazy. In 1958, white people in Britain were marching through for almost a week. For almost a week, they were marching all over the town with banners that read, "Deport all the N-words." And then they started beating up, people from Jamaica and Bahamas and stuff like that. However, popular grassroots racism was not the crucial pressure that led to anti immigrant legislation. Racial tensions were far too scattered and sporadic to have had any inexorable impact on local, let alone central, government practice. In 1968, Enoch Powell noted that immigration affected only a minority of towns, perhaps 60 out of 600 parliamentary constituencies. Far more crucial than the strength of popular pressure was the extent to which racism of the people, no matter how weak, was used by political elites to legitimate anti-black measures. At local level, what were claimed to be spontaneous expressions of popular hostility turn out on closer inspection to have been channeled and stimulated by educated members of the middle class, whether activists from extreme right-wing movements, editors of local newspapers, or members of pressure groups like the Birmingham Immigration Control Association. But most crucial of all was the failure of political elites, of MPs and government ministers to tackle racist movements and a tendency to cave in to the slightest pressure from within their own constituencies. Backbench MPs from both parties began to press for black immigration controls after the 1958 riots, much in line with the thinking of the Daily Sketch, which called for an end to the tremendous influx of colored people from the Commonwealth. Overcrowding has fostered vice, drugs, prostitution, and the use of knives. For years, the white people have been tolerant. Now their tempers are up. Quite crucial to the entrenchment of racism was the way in which black immigrants were perceived as the problem, rather than those indigenous people who subjected them to abuse, violence, and discrimination in housing and employment. MPs, instead of seeking to tackle prejudice through education, firmly rejecting teddy boy rioters and bigots, or supporting programs to reduce inner city blight, blamed the immigrants for those conditions of which they were the principal victims. Already in the 1950s, government carefully avoided social and economic programs that would have helped newly arrived West Indians to adjust to life in Britain and also reduce racial tensions, since it was feared that improved conditions would attract further immigration. In general, politicians, in demanding controls, claimed to speak up for the legitimate fears of the British people, thereby promoting the racism of small, scattered, and unrepresentative groups into an expression of the national will. So basically, instead of the politicians telling the racist poor whites, hey, y'all got to stop being ignorant and violent and harassing these people that are coming to work, the politicians said, well, we have to represent our constituents, and if this is making them unruly and unhappy, then we should kick out all the Negroes. That's essentially what the British politicians said. This reminds me a lot. This is almost word for word what was written in David Olusoga's great book, Black and British, that I'll always promote. Excellent, excellent book. All of y'all should read it. Anyway, however, both conservative and labor politicians, in the very moments of supporting immigration controls, were keen to assert their public opposition to any forms of prejudice on the grounds of race, color, or creed. Going here to Dorval, he says, I think this book may talk about Eisenhower helping to establish religious right ruling America, a history of wealth and power and democracy. Shout out to Dorval. Another great book recommendation. We're going to save that, screenshot that, and we might pick that one up as well and read that. Shout out to Dorval. So, all right. The term racist in the 1950s and early 60s carried a high degree of obloquy, and moral condemnation. Ooh, new word. Okay. Obloquy. Obloquy. Strong public condemnation. Interesting. All right, this is the new word. Strong public condemnation. Obloquy. Let's put that here. How do you say it? How do we say this word? Obloquy. Okay, interesting. All right. So it's like public shame. Obloquy. Sounds like a punishment. Sounds like an official punishment. You have been sentenced to 30 years of obloquy. Anyway, the term racist in the 1950s and early 60s carried a high degree of public condemnation, or obloquy, and no leading politician or mainstream party wished to be tarred with the accusation of racism. Cabinet papers now released reveal that a major dilemma facing both conservative and labor governments was how to impose strict controls on black or new Commonwealth immigrants, but not on white immigrants from the old Commonwealth or Ireland, while still claiming to be anti-racist. The solution was found by the Home Secretary Butler in the Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962, which, through a voucher scheme that gave priority of entry to those who already had a job to come to or had qualifications that were in short supply, built in a bias against black immigrants while leaving access open to migrants from Australia, Canada, and South Africa. Butler, in private, noted, "The great merit of this scheme is that it can be presented as making no distinction on grounds of race and color. Although the scheme purports to relate solely to employment and to be non-discriminatory, its aim is primarily social, and its restrictive effect is intended to, and would, in fact, operate on colored people almost exclusively." So basically, the British parties are saying, we have to represent our people's will, that they don't want black people in their neighborhoods, even though they're just doing their jobs, not committing more crime than any other people. In fact, they're working the lowest paid jobs that people don't want to do in Britain. We have to make our stupid white constituents happy by limiting the amount of immigrants that can come in, right? And so the British politicians, though, are saying, we're not racist, though. And being called racist was the worst thing imaginable. It would just make a white man faint at the very idea he could ever be racist, right? And so, they have to walk this fine line where they're passing this law that says the people from the Commonwealth that fought in World War I, World War II, and helped save our countries, now they can't come, and we would much rather have white people come. But it's not racist. It's not a racist law, right? Anyway. Although the Labour Party in opposition under the leadership of Hugh Gaitskell had strongly opposed the 1962 Act as racist, the Labour government that came to power in 1964 under Harold Wilson introduced even more stringent controls in its white paper on immigration of 1965. In the 1964 general election, the Conservative candidate for Smethwick, Peter Griffins, ran a blatantly racist campaign in which the infamous slogan, "If you want a N-word neighbor, vote Labor. If you want an N-word neighbor, vote Labor," was deployed against Patrick Gordon Walker, a member of the shadow cabinet. Walker was defeated by a local swing to the Conservatives of 7.2%, while the national swing to Labor was 3.5%. Wow, so this guy won. This guy basically won his election by openly campaigning in the UK. If you want a N-word living next to you, vote Labor. He won his election against the left-wing guy, even though the right overall lost the election nationally. Crazy. So from this humiliating defeat, Labor drew the lesson that grassroots electoral mobilization against immigration presented a real danger, one that it would best counter by itself, taking a hard immigrant stance. The Labor government, in its drive to implement more draconian measures against non-European immigrants in the 1965 White Paper, was motivated by political and electoral considerations rather than any economic logic, since there was still a labor shortage. Richard Crossman, a cabinet minister, wrote in his diary at the time of the 1965 White Paper, which made the 1962 Act even tougher and more restrictive. Ever since the Smethwick election, it has been quite clear that immigration can be the greatest potential vote loser for the Labour Party if we are seen to be permitting a flood of immigrants to come in and blight the central areas in all our cities. We have become illiberal and lowered the quotas at a time when we have an acute shortage of labor. We felt we had to out-Trump the Tories by doing what they would have done and so transforming their policy into a bipartisan policy. Neo-Marxists or economic theories have argued that the ebb and flow of labor immigration into Western Europe was dictated by the needs of capitalism and the imposition of controls, particularly after 1973. Was primarily linked to economic recession, growing unemployment, and a global restructuring of capital, which, instead of bringing cheap labor into Europe, now placed its manufacturing investment in poor developing countries. The British case presents a problem for such an interpretation, since the introduction of immigration controls preceded those of continental Europe by a decade, and, without any economic rationale, appears to have been inspired by political considerations and electoral opportunism. Britain was not an anomalous as it appears since the debates on immigration and refugee controls throughout Europe in the last quarter of the 20th century, in spite of closer correlation with global recession, was similarly determined more by surges in political racism than by economic considerations. Britain was, in the 1960s, a precursor, in another way, of a second phase that spread through continental Europe during the last 2 decades of the 20th century. This arose from a perception that even watertight controls on external frontiers could not prevent minority populations from settling permanently and, through their higher birth rates, demographically swamping the indigenous people and their culture. If the enemy was now within, immigration controls alone would no longer suffice, and the logical solution was repatriation. The 1962 Immigration Act, reinforced by the 1965 White Paper, brought a virtual halt to primary labor immigration from the new Commonwealth. However, the act led to a surge in immigration by those aiming to beat the ban. In 1961, some 136,400 new Commonwealth immigrants arrived, compared to 57,000 to 700 in 1960. But far more crucial in the long run was that migrants, predominantly males who had left their families at home and regarded their stay as temporary, decided to bring over wives and children rather than risk being refused re-entry after a visit home. Immigration controls thus had the opposite effect from the intended and resulted in the acceleration of family reunification and the formation of permanent minority settlements. The near total ban on labor immigration could not bring a halt to the process of family reunification, which was protected in both national and international law, and this continued for many decades to fuel the racist debate, particularly as dependents seemed to increase the burden on welfare and social costs, education, state housing, health. A first phase of racism, one targeted at temporary labor migrants, thus gave way to a second phase, which was fueled by the recognition that black immigrants were here for good and constituted a permanent presence within British society. This second phase was precipitated by Enoch Powell in his notorious speeches of 1968. The core of Powell's message was constructed in 2 parts. Firstly, he claimed black minorities could never assimilate into English society, and their essential cultural and religious difference would always constitute an alien danger to indigenous identity. The West Indian or Asian does not, by being born in England, become an Englishman. In law, he becomes a United Kingdom citizen by birth. In fact, he is a West Indian or an Asian still. This was a secular equivalent of the old anti-Semitic tag that the converted Jew always remained a Jew, and at the same time pointed forward to the new racism, which was grounded on cultural difference. Secondly, Powell estimated that even with the total halt to immigration, the non-European rate of reproduction was so high that blacks would still, like a Trojan horse, come to flood the native English, so that they were made strangers in their own country. Go in here. Door of L says, Masters, The Invisible War of the Powerful Against Their Subjects by Marco D. Aramo. This is a whole library, man. You flooded me with a bunch of books. I appreciate it, man. Shout out to Door of L. Much love for the book suggestions. It's good to know brothers out there reading. It's good to know brothers are out there reading, man. That's what makes me happy, man. I'm smiling ear to ear because of that. Anyway. So a constituent, one of the decent, ordinary fellow Englishmen for whom Powell acted as tribune, claimed he would emigrate if he had the means. In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. This deliberate inversion of the historic association of blackness with the inferior position of the plantation slave, with the powerful white majority presented as the persecuted minority or victim, was later to become a key device of European new racism. There could, argued Powell, be only one solution to the impending disaster, and that was to end family reunification and to remove non-European immigrants through a ministry of repatriation. Powell succeeded in providing a whole new impetus to British racism by shifting the focus from immigration control, a goal that had been largely achieved by cross-party consensus, to the permanence of the enemy within. By 1968, Powell had developed all the key components of the anti-black racist discourse that remained essentially unchanged down to the present time. All later controversies over further immigration legislation relating to the arrival of Ugandan, Kenyan, Hong Kong, and other ex-colonial passport holders, as well as illegal immigrants, asylum seekers, and bogus refugees, continue to be formulated in identical terms. Very interesting chapter right here. All right. Doravel says, hit my email. I got plenty of sources. Email me. You can find the email for me in the About section, and we will begin correspondence, man. But all these books that you put in here, we're going to copy them. We're going to save them as well. Screenshot that, and we will include them in the library that I have on my computer, which is already quite extensive. I got a long reading list for the Book React series, but all new books are welcome, and we will try to cover everything. All right. Going here to the comments, going back to the book, Immigration and Racial Politics in France. The trajectory followed in the racialization of British politics began circa 1958 and 68 is informative of a pattern that was to be followed at the later stage by most EU states. Space does not allow a discussion for all these nations, but here an examination of the evolution in France is compared to Britain in order to illustrate a process that was general to Western Europe. In 1945, the French government calculated that economic reconstruction required the introduction of 5 million immigrants, about 4 times more than the British estimates for the UK economy in 46. Although the French also favored the selection of sound elements, those national or white ethnic groups which would be most readily assimilable, in reality they were unable to halt the massive arrival of Algerians who had complete freedom of movement between 1946 and 62. However, France was quite different from Britain in that throughout the period from 45 to 74, the long phase of dynamic post-war economic growth, the rationale of labor immigration never became an issue central to political debate, party, campaigning, and the electoral process. The question of immigration was regulated almost solely by civil servants and ministers from a technocratic and economic perspective, through administrative decrees and circulars. Their prime concern was with estimations of labor supply within the parameters of the various 5-year plans. Not a single act of legislation on immigration came before Parliament between 1945 and 80. This is not to deny the high levels of hostility towards ethnic minorities that was fermenting at the grassroots within local French society, but this was generally inchoate and not channeled in such a way as to find strong political expression. Inchoate is one of those words I see often. Never look it up. I'm going to look this up right here because I think this is a good word. Inchoate. Inchoate, sorry. All right. Just begun and not so formally developed. Rudimentary. All right. So we're going to put this in the chat too. Inchoate. All right. By the way, I like how the French, at least back then, were doing immigration. It was technocratic, bureaucratic. It's not really up for public debate. There's a ministry of immigration that handles that decides every year how many immigrants can come in, how many, can't stay. They do deportations, et cetera, right? That sounds more logical than just letting, the masses say there's too many immigrants, they're taking our jobs, and then we get the Trumps and the Le Pens and the Orbans, et cetera, bad people like that, right? Let immigration be a technocratic process if we have a state at all, I would say. Anyway, continuing here. So, immigration was thus peripheral to mainstream French politics, and before 1974, few challenged the idea that cheap and temporary migrant labor was to be encouraged, especially since it maintained French competitiveness by exerting a strong downward pressure on wage inflation. How and why did this neutral issue move to the center of French politics and public debate between circa 1972 and 1982? Firstly, although in principle the state recruited all foreign labor through the Office of National Immigration, established in November 1945, in reality the majority arrived as clandestine workers, 79% in 65. This unregulated immigration sauvage meant that enormous and largely ignored social problems were building up, and it was with some sense of shock that the Prime Minister, Chaban Delmas, acknowledged in 1970 the existence of nearly 400 shantytowns, Secondly, by the early 1970s, immigrants were becoming increasingly organized and militant, and engaged in rent strikes in government hostels, factory occupations, and a series of bitter strikes on the theme equal pay for equal work. Such involvement in trade union activity threatened to undermine the whole logic of a guest worker system, in which quiescent migrants represented a malleable productive force, a proletarian labor power devoid of social costs. So basically, when the migrants started getting uppity, then that's when immigration became a political issue in France, right? Thirdly, immigrant workers, particularly those from North Africa, became the target of a grassroots wave of racial violence and murders in the summer of 1973. Algerian migrants had, ever since the First World War, been the object of French racism and were perceived as volatile and hot-blooded primitives who endangered French women and children, spread disease, and increased crime. French decolonization had been far more traumatic and bloody than in the British case, with the crushing defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and the Algerian War of 1954 to 1962, and the sudden retreat from empire nourished deep-seated hatred against inferior peoples, who were not only the victors, but who continued to invade the metropolitan heartland as immigrants. During the Algerian War, the National Liberation Front had established a sophisticated organization in the émigré community, raised funds, and opened a second front against police and military targets, and the French state riposted with mass arrests, torture, and exceptional counter-violence, right? So basically, the Algerians in France were doing terrorism. They were doing a terrorism because the war was on. When they were fighting in their homeland for their freedom, they were also fighting in mainland France, right? Because if the French are going to come to Algeria and drop nuclear bombs all over Africa and basically poison the people there through radioactive material, why can't the Algerians go to France and do a few car bombings? Why not? Why not? Why not? Now, I'm not excusing violence, but I'm just explaining how wars are won. I love how, certain white people say, oh, the terrorists are the Arabs and they're fighting wars and, they're blowing themselves up and killing innocent people. What does the West do every single day? What does the West do every single day? Only a month ago, Donald Trump and his cohorts in the White House dropped a bomb on a Yemeni family while they were celebrating Ramadan. A whole family wiped off. There's a whole genocide going on in Gaza right now that the Western world seems to be behind as they continue to fund Netanyahu's war on Arab people as children melt from the bombs that are dropped on their bodies, right? So what are we talking about here? I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent, but shout out to Algeria. They're hella racist against black people, but boy as hell did they fight a war for their independence. I mean, come on. The Algerian Civil War is hands down one of the top 3 hardest things that have ever happened on Africa. All right. Doravel says, are you the same person who interviewed Umar Johnson? No, I have never interviewed Umar Johnson. I've never met Umar Johnson, but shout out to Umar Johnson. Snow bunnies forever. Black queens never. Snow bunnies forever. Black queens never. I'm joking. I know somebody's going to clip that, but you know how it is, man. Shout out to Umar Johnson, man. Shout out to Umar, whatever he's up to. Anyway, where were we? So on the night of October 17th, 1961, the Paris police massacred dozens of Algerians peacefully demonstrating in favor of the FLN. The utilization in Paris of Algerian police brigades, the Harkis, and of military intelligence officers placed under the command of the prefect of the police, Maurice Papon, a senior administrator renowned for his harsh counterinsurgency operations in Morocco and Algeria, represented the penetration of colonial forms of repression, violence, and racism into the capital. By the end of the war in 1962, some 2.3 million conscripts had been in service. By the end of the war in 1962, some 2.3 million conscripts had seen service in Algeria, many returning to civilian life infected by colonial and barrack room racism. 1 million Pied Noirs, or white feet, European refugees from Algeria, settled in France. Millions of Blackfeet, European refugees from Algeria, settled in France, many bringing with them deeply ingrained colonialist attitudes of native inferiority, which were now further accentuated by the bitterness of expulsion. However, while bloody processes of decolonization fueled anti-immigrant racism, it is interesting to note that the Pied Noir's presence made little impact on French racial politics until the watershed of 1973 and 1974, a decade after their arrival. In other words, racial mobilization was crucially dependent, not on grassroots or localized prejudice, but on the national political context. Fascist activists and organizations like the Ordre Nouveau and the Front National, which had a significant Pied Noir membership, only placed anti-immigration policies on the agenda in 73. And late in that year, they orchestrated a wave of anti-Arab killings and bombings in Marseille. My God. Although government officials were investigating and moving towards the idea of immigration controls from circa 1968, the 1973 violence, not unlike the Notting Hill riots of 1958, constituted a significant watershed in the racialization of politics. President Georges Pompidou, like the judiciary and ministers in the British case, asserted an official condemnation of racism, noting that France is profoundly anti-racist. There is no racism, or at least there should not be any. But he went on to utilize the violence of a tiny minority of racist agitators as an excuse for the only solution, a general and effective control of immigration. Implicit in this, as in the British case, was a process by which immigrants became problematized instead of tackling racism as its source in the French population. Solutions would be found by shutting out the alien. Interesting. Going to the contents. Dorvel says, I'm not the most savvy YouTube viewer, but I don't see your email in the About header. Okay, well, I'm going to drop it here. Man. You can all reach me at simonnhill90@gmail. If you're trying to reach me, hit me up there. Holla at your boy, and I will reply. I promise. I'll try. I get a lot of emails, man. All right. So the process of post-war decolonization was to have a major impact on the racialization of politics in a number of West European states: Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Italy, and Portugal. Independence struggles were portrayed in the European media as the work of terrorists and criminals engaged in the savage butchery of white settlers. The gaining of independence and the process of decolonization, whether carried out through violent or peaceful means, led to the repatriation of many thousands of government officials and settlers who injected colonial racism into metropolitan society. While empires were intact, imperial governments had an interest in restraining racism at home or keeping immigration open, since this fostered good relations with native elites, restrained nationalist militancy, and favored economic relations with the metropolis. After independence, many European politicians were prepared to jettison empire completely so as to remove all obligations to post-colonial governments and peoples. A paternalist imperialism, tempered by the need to care for backward black societies, was displaced by an insular nationalism, which aimed to expunge from memory the enormous debt owed to colonial societies that had for centuries been plundered and stripped of their wealth. Enoch Powell, an arch-imperialist, was by the late 1950s moving to a Little Englander position, as he abandoned the Commonwealth as a liability and called for a halt to the black invasion. All primary labor immigration to France was stopped by a circular of July 19th, 1974. However, as with the Immigration Act of '62 in Britain, far from marking a termination of anti-immigrant agitation, it opened the way to a deepening racialization of politics. As in Britain, the virtual closing of the frontiers led to a realization that this alone was not going to resolve the issue of family reunification and the growth of permanent minority settlement. Strict immigration controls only served to terminate rotation, the tendency for male migrants to periodically return home to visit their families in North Africa, Turkey, and West Africa, and accelerated family reunification in Europe. A particularly dramatic shift in racial politics occurred during the period 1980 to 1984, with all the mainstream parties, including the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, shifting over to a hard anti-immigrant position. Why this shift occurred when it did still requires a closer investigation by historians. But in general, it appears that political factors, especially electoral opportunism, played a more fundamental role than pure economic causes, a cost-benefit calculation of immigration in a context of recession. Although the great Giscard d'Estaing presidency 1974 to 1981, introduced a series of harsh anti-immigrant measures, like the Fontenette Circular. It had been widely argued that the PCF was the first major party to stir up anti-immigrant prejudice and to use it as a means to mobilize public opinion. Although the PCF prided itself on its traditions of solidarity with foreign workers, from the late 1960s onwards, party leaders began to complain that conservative governments were systematically dumping immigrant workers and their families in the red suburbs, the communist-controlled communes in the industrial zones that encircled central Paris. The immigrants who had large families pressed hard on scarce resources of council housing, education, and health in precisely those working-class municipalities that were suffering from inadequate state funding and had the most overstretched social services. Although there was some basis to the critique of a capitalist system and bourgeoisie government that failed to invest in the working class and immigrant ghettos, the PCF campaign on this issue began to assume a racist color. From 1978 onwards, a number of communist mayors blocked immigrants' access to public housing within their communes and even placed a quota limit of 15% on immigrant children going to the summer holiday camps for deprived children. See, once again, we love the white liberals. We love the white communists in general. But once again, a critique of capitalism does not automatically make you an ally. Being anti-capitalist does not automatically make you an ally. Because these French white communists were so quick to say, yeah, on one level, we support, anti-colonialism and stuff like that. But at the other level, when the immigrants are actually in the communist areas, they say, they forget all humanity and just look at these people as, forces of the capitalists to try to break apart the people, break apart the solidarity. All right. Anyway, Doravel sent an email. He said, I got you. Shout out to Doravel, man. Shout out to everybody else who's going to show love on this channel, man. And, defend this channel at all costs. Didn't get anything from you, from Doravel yet. I just checked my email. But, anyway, continuing here. So, such measures were legitimated by the discriminatory concept of a threshold of tolerance, through which it was claimed that immigrants reaching a certain level of population in local housing or schooling would automatically trigger a natural, hostile, and even violent response among the French inhabitants. The exclusionary strategy was officially endorsed by the Central Party, the Political Bureau, on November 5, 1980, and was soon followed by the infamous bulldozer wrecking of an immigrant worker hostel at Vitry by a communist commando led by the mayor. Wow. In February 1981, the communist mayor of Montigny, Robert Hue, later to become leader of the PCF, coordinated a law and order campaign in which a Moroccan family accused of drug dealing were made the target of street demonstrations. Throughout France, at a time of deepening recession, immigrants became those to blame for unemployment, the housing crisis, a decline in educational standards, rising crime rates, and insecurity. Drug dealing, a breakdown in morality, an overstretched health service, and of every other conceivable social ill. Why did the PCF, which had an honorable tradition of anti-racism, become infected with racism at this particular juncture in 1978 and 81? Firstly, the anti-immigrant stance did not come about through an inexorable pressure from below, a popular agitation before which communist leaders were forced to bow. There was some rank-and-file hostility towards immigrants, but the Communist Party of France, Popular Communist Party of France, I think, but the PCF leadership only decided to channel this and to give it official blessing in the intense campaigning that preceded the presidential and parliamentary elections of 1981. The rupture of the electoral alliance with the socialists, the union of the left, the erosion of the traditional working class base of the communists, as well as bitter internal splits and the expulsion of leading intellectuals, drove the PCF leadership into a desperate populist strategy and an appeal to the worst prejudices of its cadres within the red fortresses of outer Paris. The PCF case, like that of the British Labour Party, at a similar conjuncture in 1964 and 65, demonstrates that the racialization of mainstream politics was fundamentally the work of political elites, both at local and central levels, rather than a response to inexorable public pressure. Interesting. So basically, the elites were pushing this racist line. It wasn't like the people there were saying that they wanted the immigrants out. It was basically the Communist Party elites. So the PCF was not alone in this stance. The PCF was not alone in this, since a growing racist response to immigration swept across the political spectrum. In 1980 to 1981, the socialists attacked the communists for engaging in a vile and demagogic racist campaign, and yet numerous socialist municipalities with a large immigrant presence were engaged in identical maneuvers. The leftist socialist government that came to power in 81 did introduce a liberal policy on immigration, legalizing the position of thousands of clandestine workers and injecting investment into the most deprived ghettos. But this progressive stance was rapidly eroded as the socialist economic experiment collapsed by 83 and the PS swung to the right. The Front National, which had been a marginal force in French politics, made a dramatic breakthrough in 83 and 84. In the small town of Dreux, the FN, playing a crude racist and anti-immigrant campaign in the 1983 municipal elections, entered into an electoral pact with the Gaullists and came to share power in the town hall. Such an alliance indicated how far center-right parties were willing to go in accepting populist racism in order to make electoral gains. But at the same time, such actions legitimated Le Pen's movement. In the European elections of 1984, the FN won over 11% of the national vote. All the major political parties took fright at this dramatic surge, but instead of trying to contain this danger through a coherent anti-racist position, they took on a hard anti-immigrant stance to outflank the FN on the right, a move that only served to further legitimate and reinforce racist attitudes in French society. All right? So, Dorvel says, check your email again. All right, so he sent the books he suggested. Shout out to Dorvel. I got them here, the PDFs. Hope y'all aren't trying to send me viruses, man. Hope y'all showing love to a brother. Dorvel, I'm not saying that you're out to get me, but I'm just a little bit paranoid because most of my interactions on YouTube have been with hate. You get what I'm saying? But shout out to Dorvel. We're going to download those books. I think I got it right here. Let's see if I can open it right here. Yeah, History of Wealth, Power, and Democracy. Got the book right here on my phone. Shout out to Dorvel for that. Shout out. I love when a brother sends me books, and that's what we should be doing, man. That's what we should be doing. Continuing here, so in many ways, France presents a more typical example of the growth of anti-immigrant politics in Europe than the British case. The French government closed its borders to labor immigration by a circular of July 19, 1974. West Germany and Denmark had already followed a similar line in November 73 and were soon imitated by Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Austria in 74. The synchronicity of frontier closure would suggest that national governments were responding to the same fundamental causes. And the most plausible explanation is that which links immigration controls to the onset of the oil crisis and global recession of 1973 and 74. The economic crisis led to an increase in unemployment and simultaneously undermined the ability of European states to raise taxation and to sustain the post-war liberal consensus built upon Keynesianism and state welfare systems that included well-funded public housing, education, and health. The very resources now under attack from the Thatcherite policies that immigrants appeared to be in competition for. However, the introduction of immigration controls, far from following a purely economic logic, may have been determined primarily by political considerations and economic recession, served more as an excuse for illiberal measures rather than as a prime cause. Immigration controls across Europe were fundamentally racist in a number of ways. Firstly, they were not colorblind, but quite selective, allowing preferred white migrants continuing access. At a purely cost-benefit level of analysis, immigrants in many states continue to contribute far more to the national wealth than they took from it in social costs. But more crucially, governments and political leaders of most major parties quietly concurred with a shared discourse that presented immigrants as the cause of deteriorating conditions in inner city slums, growing crime, educational failure, social and cultural dislocation, and threatening racial tension. Ethnic minorities constituted the problem, not indigenous racism or the failure of government policy. The political drive behind anti immigrant measures was also shown by the fact that whenever legislation was introduced to impose tight and often repressive controls, agitation inevitably continued for further prohibitions and police regulations to stem floods and invasions. Even when immigration had been reduced to a trickle and the numbers were so low that they were almost totally insignificant in relation to total population size. In such campaigns, that continued to exercise tabloid editors, xenophobic pundits, and politicians of all political persuasions. What was most crucially at stake was the assertion of a national identity and sovereignty that was perceived to be at risk from barbaric hordes pressing in teeming numbers against the fragile external walls of Europe. And that will be the end of chapter 6. We'll pick up with chapter 7, which is the final chapter in this book, The New Racism and National Populism, tomorrow. Looking forward to doing that. Shout out to Doravel. He says, I'm a real man, no games here. Shout out to Doravel. Let's see, he also sent me the other book that is downloading right now. Doravel sent this book, Project Black Macho Revisited, Reflections of a Snap Queen. And I got this book. Well, it's just a PDF right here. This is worth listening to, reading, talking about, etc. So shout out to Door of L, man. You're a real one. You're a real one. And yeah, looking forward to hearing what y'all have to say. Looking forward to hearing what y'all say about this book reading. And as we get closer to this book being over, I'm glad that we now have new books to add to this collection right here. So I'm going to wrap up this live stream. Y'all be easy out there, and see you tomorrow.